Ever heard about that place, out in the ocean where things just disappear? Ships, planes, gone, without a trace.
Oh, the Bermuda Triangle?
The one and only. It's been this legendary mystery for decades. You hear all these stories about sea monsters and strange forces.
Yeah, it's the kind of thing that really captures the imagination, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Oh.
So welcome to Dansplain, everybody. I'm Edward.
And I'm Lily.
And today, we're taking a deep dive into the Bermuda Triangle. We're going to try to separate the myth from the reality, look at what we actually know about this area.
Right, because there's a lot of information out there. Reports, investigations, theories.
Exactly. We've got stuff from scientific organizations, from government agencies like the U.S. Coast Guard and NOAA.
And of course, we can't forget all the articles and books that have helped to create this legend.
So our mission today is to see what those sources tell us, to understand why the Bermuda Triangle is such a big deal, and to figure out what's fact and what's fiction.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so first things first. Where did this whole idea of the Bermuda Triangle even come from?
Well, it's kind of a vaguely defined area in the Atlantic, right? Generally, people say it's bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan, Puerto Rico.
Right, a big triangle.
A huge triangle. And depending on who you ask, it can cover anywhere from like 500,000 to 1.5 million square miles.
Wow, that's a lot of ocean.
It is. And this reputation it has as a place where things vanish, that really started to build in the mid-20th century.
So relatively recently then.
Yeah, pretty much. There were some early articles that started to bring attention to it. Like in 1950, Edward Van Winkle Jones wrote a piece for the Miami Herald, an Associated Press story called Mystery of the Sea.
Okay, and what was that about?
It talked about some ships and planes that had gone missing in the area between Florida and Bermuda, just raising the question of what might be happening.
Interesting. So people were starting to notice a pattern.
Right. And then in 1952, George X. Sand published an article in Fate magazine called Sea Mystery at Our Back Door. This one really focused on the disappearance of Flight 19.
Ah, Flight 19, that's one of the really famous cases. We'll definitely have to talk about that one in more detail.
Definitely. But then the term Bermuda Triangle, the name we all know it by, that actually came from Vincent Gaddis. He wrote an article for Argus Sea magazine in 1964 called The Deadly Bermuda Triangle.
So he was the one who put it all together, connected the dots, so to speak.
Exactly. He took a bunch of incidents, including Flight 19, and kind of created this narrative of a dangerous, mysterious area. But the real explosion in popularity came with Charles Berlitz's book, The Bermuda Triangle.
Oh yeah, that was a huge bestseller. Everyone was reading that.
It was massive, sold over 20 million copies. And what's interesting about Berlitz's book is that he really went all in on some of the wilder theories.
Like what?
Well, he talked about the lost city of Atlantis and even suggested that aliens might be involved. That really caught people's attention.
Yeah, I can see why. It's a lot more exciting than just like bad weather or navigational errors.
Right. And it's funny because even earlier events like the disappearance of the USS Cyclops back in 1918 got kind of folded into the Bermuda Triangle story, even though they happened before the legend really existed.
So the narrative kind of grew over time, incorporating more and more incidents.
Exactly. It became this big overarching mystery.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those specific disappearances now. Like we mentioned earlier, Flight 19 is probably the most famous case. What do we know about that?
So Flight 19 was a group of 5 Navy bombers that disappeared in December of 1945. They were on a training mission out of Fort Lauderdale, Florida.
Okay, standard stuff.
Right, routine. There were 14 crew members in total, and the flight was led by Lieutenant Charles Taylor.
And what happened?
Well, they were flying this triangular course over the Atlantic, and then around 2:10 in the afternoon, Taylor started reporting problems. He said his compasses weren't working, and he was having trouble figuring out where they were. Yeah, not good. Some of his radio transmissions were pretty telling, he said, "We're heading northeast. I don't know where we are. We must have got lost after that last turn."
So they were disoriented.
Completely. And then by about 5:50 p.m., all contact was lost.
And that was it?
That was it. They just disappeared.
And didn't another plane go missing while searching for them?
Yeah, that's the really tragic part. A PBM Mariner flying boat was sent out to look for Flight 19, but it vanished too. 13 more crew members lost.
Wow. That really adds to the mystery.
It does. And the Navy's initial report just said the cause was unknown, which of course fueled all the speculation.
But looking at it now, what do we think probably happened?
Well, the most likely explanation is that Lieutenant Taylor made some navigational
That's
errors.
okay, that makes sense. He was lost after all.
Right. And apparently he wasn't all that familiar with the area, and he had a bit of a history of getting lost on flights. He'd actually ditched planes a couple of times during World War II.
Huh. So maybe not the best guy to be leading a training mission.
Maybe not. And on top of that, the weather that day was pretty bad. There were reports of rough seas and high waves. As for the mariners, those planes were known for being kind of, well, prone to accidents.
Oh.
Yeah, they were sometimes called flying gas tanks because they had a tendency to leak fuel, so it's entirely possible that one just exploded.
Okay, so that's Flight 19, a combination of human error and bad luck, most likely.
Seemed like it.
All right, let's move on to another big one. The USS Cyclops. This was a massive Navy ship that disappeared in 1918, right?
That's right. It was a collier, over 540 feet long.
And just gone. No trace.
No trace. 306 people on board, just vanished. It's actually the biggest non-combat loss of life in U.S. naval history.
Wow, I didn't realize it was that significant. So what happened?
Well, the Cyclops was sailing from Brazil to Baltimore, carrying a load of manganese ore. They sent their last message on March 4th near Barbados and said everything was fine, the weather was good, but they never made it to Baltimore.
And no distress signals, no wreckage?
Nothing. It's like they just sailed off the edge of the map.
I bet there were a lot of theories at the time.
Oh, definitely. Especially since it happened during World War I, people thought it might have been a German U-boat attack.
Right, that makes sense.
But there's no evidence to support that.
So what do we think happened?
Well, the most likely explanations are either a sudden, massive storm or some kind of structural failure on the ship itself.
Okay, let's break those down.
So first, the storm. There are records of really bad weather in that area at that time. We're talking huge waves, strong winds, the kind of stuff that could easily sink a ship.
Especially a big, heavy one like the Cyclops.
Right. And then there's the possibility of a structural problem. The Cyclops was known to have some issues. It had a damaged engine, and its keel was uneven. That could have made it unstable, especially with a heavy cargo.
So basically, it might have just broken apart in rough seas.
Possibly. It's also worth noting that collier ships, like the Cyclops, they weren't designed to be particularly seaworthy. They were basically just big, floating cargo containers.
Okay, so maybe not built for a major storm. All right, let's move on to another one. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen. That name alone sounds kind of spooky.
It does, doesn't it? This was a tanker that disappeared in 1963. It was carrying molten sulfur, which is pretty dangerous stuff.
Oh, yeah, I bet.
And it just vanished. 39 crew members gone.
Where was it headed?
It was sailing from Texas to Virginia. The last communication was near the Florida Keys. Then, nothing.
Did they find anything at all?
Some debris was found and a few life jackets, but no major wreckage.
So, another mystery. What do we think caused this one?
Well, again, it seems like a combination of factors. First, the ship itself wasn't in great shape. It was a converted World War II tanker, so it probably had some structural weaknesses.
Okay, so not built for the long haul.
Right. And then there was a storm in the area at the time with pretty high winds. And, of course, there's the sulfur.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Flammable stuff.
Extremely flammable. So if there was a leak or an explosion, that could have sunk the ship very quickly.
Okay, so another case where we can point to plausible explanations, even if we don't have all the answers.
Right. It's not like these ships were just swallowed up by some mysterious force.
Right. There are real-world factors at play here. Speaking of which, you mentioned the Connemara IV earlier. That one's a little different, isn't it? Because the boat was found, but the crew was missing.
Yeah, it's a strange one. The Connemara IV was a yacht that was found adrift southeast of Bermuda in 1955.
So the boat was fine.
Relatively speaking, the sails were torn and there was some flooding, but the boat itself was intact. But the 4 people who were on board, they were gone.
And this was after a hurricane, right?
Yeah, just a few days after Hurricane Ione, which is actually kind of interesting because the boat survived the hurricane while it was docked in Bermuda. But then a few days later, the crew disappears.
So what do we think happened?
The most likely scenario is that they got hit by a sudden squall or a rogue wave. You know, those really big, unexpected waves that can just come out of nowhere.
Yeah, I've heard those can be terrifying. Just a wall of water.
Exactly. And the Bermuda area is known for having unpredictable weather.
So it's possible they were just swept off the boat by a freak wave.
It's definitely possible.
Okay, so that's another case where, while it's mysterious, we have a pretty good explanation. And there are a few others that are often mentioned in connection with the Bermuda Triangle, right? Like the Star Tiger and Star Ariel, and that old story about the Ellen Austin.
Yeah, those are some of the other big ones. The Star Tiger and Star Ariel were both British passenger planes that disappeared near Bermuda in the late 1940s.
And what about them? Any clues?
Well, the Star Tiger was flying pretty low, maybe to avoid bad weather, and that could have been a problem if they ran into rough seas. The Star Ariel, there was no distress call or anything, so it seems like whatever happened, it happened fast.
So, again, we're left with possibilities, but no definitive answers.
Right. And the Ellen Austin, that's more of a ghost ship story. It's said that this American ship encountered another ship that was just drifting with no one on board.
Ghost ship.
That's the story. So the captain of the Ellen Austin supposedly put some of his crew on the other ship to sail it back to port, but then a storm hit. When they found the other ship again, it was empty.
Creepy.
Very creepy. But this story, it's more of a legend. There's not a lot of solid evidence to back it up.
Okay, so it's more folklore than fact.
Pretty much.
All right, so we've talked about some of the specific cases, but it's important to remember the bigger picture here. We've got all these stories about ships and planes disappearing in the Bermuda Triangle, but how many actually travel through that area without any problems?
Oh, tons. I mean, it's a busy shipping lane, and there are flights going over it all the time.
So statistically speaking, it's not really any more dangerous than other parts of the ocean.
Right. The disappearances we hear about, they're a tiny percentage of the total traffic. It's like if you only focus on the car accidents that happen, you might start to think that driving is incredibly dangerous, when in reality, most people drive every day without incident.
That's a good analogy. It's about perspective.
Exactly. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, they've said that the Bermuda Triangle is no more dangerous than any other well-traveled part of the ocean. And they specifically said that the combined forces of nature and human fallibility outrank even the most incredulous science fiction.
So in other words, there's no need to invoke aliens or sea monsters.
Not really, no.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the scientific explanations for what might be happening in the Bermuda Triangle. What are some of the natural factors that could be at play here?
Well, first of all, there's the weather. The Bermuda Triangle is known for having some pretty wild weather. It's in a hurricane zone, and even outside of hurricane season, you can get sudden storms, strong winds, rough seas.
So the kind of stuff that could easily sink a ship or bring down a plane.
Absolutely. And then there's the Gulf Stream, which is a powerful current that runs right through the triangle.
I've heard of that. Isn't it a warm current?
Yeah, it brings warm water up from the tropics. And that can create unpredictable weather patterns, like sudden fog banks or those really intense squalls we talked about earlier.
Okay, so that's the weather. What about other factors?
Well, there's also the issue of navigation. Back in the day, before GPS and all that, sailors had to rely on compasses and dead reckoning.
Dead reckoning, what's that?
It's basically using your speed and direction to estimate your position. It's not super accurate, especially over long distances.
I can imagine.
And in the open ocean, there aren't a lot of landmarks to help you out, so it's easy to get off course, especially if your compass isn't working right. And remember, we talked about magnetic variation earlier.
Yeah, the difference between magnetic north and true north.
Right. If you don't account for that, it can really throw off your calculations.
So even experienced navigators could get lost pretty easily.
Definitely. And then there are all the underwater hazards, like reefs and sandbars. Especially around the Bahamas, the water can be pretty shallow in places, and it's easy to run aground.
Okay, so it's a tricky area to navigate, even today.
It can be, yeah.
And I know there are some more unusual explanations that people have put forward. Like I've heard about methane hydrates. What are those?
So methane hydrates are basically these deposits of methane gas that are trapped in ice crystals under the seafloor.
Okay, interesting. And what do they have to do with the Bermuda Triangle?
Well, the theory is that if these deposits suddenly release methane, it could create a big bubble of gas in the water, and that could cause a ship to sink very quickly.
Like it's suddenly in much shallower water.
Yeah, something like that. The water density would change and the ship would lose buoyancy. And there was actually a study in 2016 that showed some weird hexagonal cloud patterns over the triangle.
Hexagonal. That's
Yes.
specific.
It is. And the researchers thought that these clouds might be caused by powerful downdrafts, which could be linked to methane releases.
Huh. So it's a possibility.
It's a possibility, but there's no direct evidence to connect these methane releases to any specific disappearances.
Okay, fair enough. What about rogue waves? Those giant waves that can just appear out of nowhere. I've heard those are a problem in the Bermuda Triangle.
Rogue waves are definitely real, and they can be incredibly dangerous, but they happen all over the world, not just in the Bermuda Triangle.
So it's not like there are more of them there than anywhere else.
Not that we know of.
Okay.
And there's one more thing I should mention, which is magnetic anomalies. There's a spot in the triangle where magnetic north and true north actually
Oh,
align.
wow.
Yeah, it's kind of unique, and that could potentially cause some confusion for navigators, especially if they're relying on older compasses. But again, it's not considered to be a major factor in most incidents.
Okay, so we've got a lot of natural explanations here, but I think it's worth talking about Larry Kusha and his book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, because he really did a lot to debunk the whole legend.
Oh, absolutely. Kusha's book was a game changer. He basically went back and looked at all the famous cases, and he found that a lot of the stories were exaggerated or just plain wrong.
Really. Give me an example.
Well, there's this ship called the Freya, which is often cited as a Bermuda Triangle disappearance. But it turns out the Freya actually sank in the Pacific Ocean.
Oh, wow. So completely wrong location.
Completely wrong location. And then there's the Mary Celeste, that famous ghost ship.
Yeah, that one's always creeped me out.
It's a great story, but it didn't happen in the Bermuda Triangle. The Mary Celeste was found near the Azores, which is way off in the Atlantic.
Huh. So it got lumped in with the Bermuda Triangle stuff, even though it had nothing to do with it.
Exactly. And Kush found that this was a pattern. A lot of the stories were just embellished, or important details were left out.
Like what?
Well, for instance, there's a ship called the Sandra that disappeared in 1950, and it's often cited as a Bermuda Triangle mystery. But the fact that it disappeared during a massive storm with hurricane-force winds, that's usually left out of the story.
So it's less mysterious when you have all the facts.
Right. Kush's conclusion was that the Bermuda Triangle mystery was basically a manufactured mystery created by sloppy reporting and sensationalism.
So not a real mystery at all.
Not really, no. And the U.S. Coast Guard agrees with Kusha. They've said that most of the incidents in the Bermuda Triangle can be explained by natural causes and human error.
Okay, so we've debunked the myth,
Uh-huh.
but we still have to talk about the really out there theories, like aliens, Atlantis, time warps.
Right, because those are a big part of the whole Bermuda Triangle legend.
So where did those ideas come from?
Well, the alien theory, that really took off after Flight 19 disappeared. It was the Cold War, and people were fascinated by UFOs. And when you have a mystery like Flight 19 with no obvious explanation, it's easy to jump to conclusions.
Sure, blame it on the aliens.
Right. And there was even a TV special in the 1970s that suggested Flight 19 had flown off to Mars.
To Mars?
Yeah, I know, it's crazy. But that was a serious theory at the time. And then there's the Atlantis connection.
Ah, the lost city.
That was Charles Berlitz's idea. He said that Atlantis might be located under the Bermuda Triangle and that its advanced technology might be interfering with ships and planes.
Like Atlantean force fields or something.
Something like that. But of course, there's no evidence that Atlantis ever existed, let alone that it's causing ships to disappear.
Right, that's more fantasy than fact.
Exactly. And then there are the time warp theories.
Time warps. Like people getting transported to another dimension?
Yeah, that kind of thing. It's based on stories like Bruce Gurnan's. He was a pilot who claimed to have flown through a weird tunnel of clouds and experienced electronic fog in the Bermuda Triangle.
And he thought this was a time warp.
He thought it might have been. He said he ended up 100 miles off course in a very short amount of time.
Huh. So maybe he just got disoriented.
That's the more likely explanation. It's easy to get confused when you're flying, especially in unusual weather conditions.
Okay, so we've got a lot of wild theories, but no real evidence to support them.
Right.
But the fact that these theories persist, even though we know they're probably not true, that says something about the power of the Bermuda Triangle myth, doesn't it?
It definitely does. It's become a part of our culture. It's in books, movies, TV shows.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
And it's not just entertainment. People really believe this stuff. They think the Bermuda Triangle is a dangerous, supernatural place.
And that's despite all the evidence to the contrary.
Exactly. And I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier. People like mysteries. They like to think there are things in the world that we can't explain.
So the Bermuda Triangle is like a modern-day myth.
Kinda, yeah. It's a story that we tell ourselves, even though we know it's probably not true.
Okay, so after all this, what's the takeaway? What should people think about the Bermuda Triangle?
I think the main takeaway is that it's not this big, scary mystery that we need to be afraid of.
It's just a normal part of the ocean.
Pretty much, yeah. It has some unique features like the Gulf Stream and the magnetic anomaly, but overall, it's not any more dangerous than other areas with similar conditions.
So the disappearances that have happened there, they can be explained by things like bad weather, navigational errors, human error.
Exactly. And the fact that it's such a busy shipping and air traffic route, that also plays a role. The more traffic you have, the more likely you are to have accidents.
Okay, so it's not aliens or sea monsters or time warps.
No, probably not.
But the fact that this myth persists, the fact that people are still fascinated by the Bermuda Triangle, that tells us something interesting about ourselves, doesn't it?
It definitely does. It tells us that we're curious, that we're imaginative, and that we love a good story, even if it's not true.
I think you're right about that. Well, Lily, thanks for joining me on this deep dive into the Bermuda Triangle. It's been fascinating.
My pleasure, Edward.
Uh,
Always happy to explore a good mystery.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Dan's Plane. If you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss our future episodes. We're always exploring new and interesting topics.
And don't forget to check out our website, www.dansplane.xyz. You'll find articles, information about our partner products, and all sorts of other cool stuff.
So until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and don't be afraid to get lost in a good story.
But maybe not in the Bermuda Triangle?
Right, maybe not in the Bermuda Triangle.